Hey guys, and welcome back. This is Demian Sky, and you're watching the second video in my series showcasing M&T 2.0, the population overhaul. I'd like to release a video each week up until release. They'll be a little bit cruder than usual because I just want to be able to spend as much time on modding and not video editing. So anyway, let's get to the point. In this video, we will be taking a closer look at one of the most important parts of the population overhaul, and that is cities. So if you recall, last time we talked a good bit about the different types of pops, right? We have rural pop living out in the countryside, and they give you a little bit of tax income, tiny bit of trade power, and they produce rural goods. But we also have urban pops. And when urban pops get together in one place, they tend to have a network relationship, and they can end up creating a large city which is capable of exerting a lot of clout on the landscape. And so here we have Venice, and you can see Venice, we have 110,000 people living there, which is a pretty big city by the standards of the era. And when a whole bunch of urban pops get together, they can exert tons of influence over trade. You can see, for instance, right here, they produce quite a bit of trade power relative to the rural pops. And you can see that in the case of Venice, just one city that is mighty enough can control tremendous amount of trade. So you can see they almost control 50% of the trade in their trade node just because of the power of Venice itself. And in addition, urban pops, they make urban goods as well. So in previous builds of M&T and in EU4 in general, you only really have one type of trade good, right? Which is what's produced down here. But what we've done in the population overhaul is we've actually created two types of trade goods. One which is rural, which is made by the rural pop, and another which is urban, which is made by the urban pop. And so you can see here that urban pops in Venice are creating glassware. 0.7 trade goods worth. And basically what you do is you can build workshops which have a certain number of slots in them, which the urban pops can work in, right? And so a workshop can allow 4 urban pops to work there to produce 0.4 trade goods worth of the urban good. And urban goods are substantially more valuable than rural goods, and they can also give your country bonuses based on how much you produce per capita. So if you produce tons of glass for a relatively small number of people, then you're able to make lots of microscopes or telescopes or whatever, and so it gives you a bonus to technology, right? There's a lot of other different types of urban goods too that give you different bonuses. And so that's what urban pops can do in general. Now, important question is, why do people even bother going to cities, right? Why do we have cities in Meiou and taxes, and how do we actually attract people to live in cities? Right, we need a system for that. And basically what we've done is we have represented the opportunity for people that exist in cities with a metric known as urban gravity. So if you look at urban gravity on a shipyard, you see base urban gravity plus 0.5. This represents how many people are willing to come to Venice to work in a shipyard, right? And so what this says here is that half of an urban pop is here in Venice for the shipyard itself, right? If we go to the urban infrastructure, it is making the city comfortable enough for 2 people to live there, and then it gives an urban gravity modifier which multiplies into all the other urban gravity in the province. And so in Venice, we have roughly about 11 urban gravity, which can support 11 people, 11 urban pops. But gravity is not it just represents the opportunity that exists in a city, and you can actually have the population go over or under the urban gravity. Actually, this tends to be the case. You infrequently have exactly the amount of urban population as urban gravity. What happens is when the urban population is below the urban gravity, so let's say we had 6 people in Venice, but there was 11 gravity, then that would mean that there was lots and lots and lots of opportunity in Venice which was not being taken advantage of. And so that means that people will flow in from the countryside to come to Venice because there's lots of opportunity there. There's 11 gravity which is not being filled because there's only 6 people there. And so the city will grow faster. On the other hand, if Venice had, let's say, 16 or 17 urban population and 11 gravity, then Venice is actually saturated as far as gravity is concerned. There's way more people than there is actually opportunity, and while they can still find work, while those people happen to be employed, there's less of a reason for people to come in from the countryside to join the city because there's not as much opportunity. So what this does in game is when something bad happens to a city, like a plague, or if it's looted and sacked and the population is damaged, as long as the urban gravity remains, people are willing to come back to the city relatively quickly because, the people that were killed left behind a lot of opportunity that wasn't filled. And so, obviously, the infrastructure and buildings of a city can create a lot of urban gravity, and they all kind of synergize together, right? Like a merchant guild gives some base urban gravity, so does the warehouse, but then it multiplies, when you have little multipliers like urban gravity modifier, it multiplies into all of the urban gravity of the entire city. So cities can get pretty big the bigger they get, or the more gravity you have. Now there's other reasons why people move to cities, other reasons there is gravity. So if we go to Paris, Paris is the capital of a large country. And because of that, it gets a decently large gravity bonus. And it also has administrative buildings too in Paris to provide civil services to all of the people in the country. And all of the bureaucrats that have to move there for that purpose, and all of the people that support the bureaucrats, are living in the city. So you can see that the rank 1 capital here gives gravity as well. And in addition to the usual commerce buildings, you also have a university as well, which, because you have faculty there, because you have clergy there, because you have students, right, those are all people living in the city. And so the urban gravity here represents the draw of the university bringing in faculty and students and things of that nature. And so when you take all of the urban gravity combined in Paris, you have roughly enough to support around 20 people. Okay, so next I'd like to talk about centers of trade, centers of production, and preeminent cities. So if you recall, in previous versions of MNT and in vanilla Europa Universalis, you have centers of trade. And centers of trade were kind of these static entities that never really changed. It kind of assumed that, for the entire 400 or 500 year history of the game, that trade only seemed to happen in these specific places no matter how big or small they got or how much of a backwater the country owning them became. But that's no longer the case in the population overhaul. In the overhaul, the centers of trade actually follow where the trade is, as opposed to the other way around. So for instance, you can see here in Venice, it has a major center of trade, the biggest one actually on the subcontinent of Italy, and it gives all these various bonuses in addition to giving urban gravity and the multiplication of rural and urban wealth. More on that on a different video. And so, because Venice has a major center of trade, it solidifies its status as an important city on the subcontinent and in the general regionality. You can see there are other ranks of centers of trade. So, for instance, you have in Milan a minor center of trade, because it does a decent amount of trade, but not nearly as much as Venice. And that contributes to the size of the city and solidifies its status. And then you can see in Liguria, we have an important center of trade, which is a little bit better. Florence, too, has a minor center of trade. And in Venice, if someone were to attack the city, or a plague were to strike, or both happened at the same time, and the city was severely damaged, and its trade power reduced, it could actually have its center of trade demoted to importance. And if Liguria, Genoa happened to be doing pretty well, it could then usurp that title and take the major center of trade for itself. Or, for instance, if Pisa were to have a revival, over the grow longer, it could claim a center of trade modifier for itself, and if it even grew large enough, it could end up becoming a major center of trade itself. All right, so the modifiers move around based on who dominates trade, and not just that, but more center of trade modifiers pop up when there is more trade in the area. And so you can see that, we have a number of center of trade modifiers throughout Italy, because a lot of trade goes through Italy. You can see in Naples they have a minor center of trade. I think Palermo does too. Yeah. So Italy does a lot of trade, and so it gets a lot of modifiers. Whereas if you go someplace else like Britain, you can see the entire subcontinent only has one dinky little minor center of trade, because they just don't do a lot of trade. But if you were to move a lot of trade through and into the British Isles, and you had tons and tons of trade power, then you would begin to see centers of trade popping up in the places that were doing the most trade, right? So if London becomes as large as it was historically, it would end up becoming a major center of trade, or even a dominant center of trade, which is even bigger than the one that Venice has. Okay. So in addition to centers of trade, we also have centers of production. Because like I mentioned earlier, cities also do a lot of, or at least can do a lot of manufacturing as well. So if you recall, Venice was creating 0.7 urban goods worth of glass, and it produces enough glass to qualify as a minor center of production. And this gives a lot of extra benefits in addition to solidifying its position as a meaningful city. It gives urban gravity, right? And just like centers of trade, the more production the entire subcontinent does, the more urban production it does, the more centers of production it can get. Of course, Venice doesn't do a heck of a lot of production. It does some, so it only gets that minor. But we do have other places that do more. So, for instance, Florence historically had 40,000 people living in the city just making cloth, right? And so you can see they make a lot of luxury cloth. They make one trade good worth of luxury cloth. And they get pretty significant bonuses as a country for that, too. And you can see they are an important center of trade. As a result, a silver class, right? There's 4 classes for each modifier. You have the minor, which is copper. You have silver, which is important. You have gold, which is major, and then you have diamond, which is dominance. Right? So Florence has a important center of production. Now you head up to Milan, and you can see they produce a significant amount of steel. Technically a tiny bit more than Florence, though it doesn't show here. And so they get a major center of production modifier. and that gives them even more urban gravity than the important. Now, the last shifting modifier we'll talk about is something known as preeminent cities. And you can see here that, or largest city, you can see here that in Venice, Venice is the largest city in the region. Right? If we go to the regional map mode, we can see in the entire region here, Venice is the biggest city. So it gets the biggest city modifier. And because it has a reputation as being a big and important city, it solidifies its position as far as gravity is concerned. Now, if we hop over to... Oh, and by the way, every region gets its own largest city, so long as it's at least 4... So long as you at least have a city of 4 population, or 5 population in the region. So you can see that Florence is the biggest city in its region, and I believe Naples is as well. Yep, Naples, largest city in the region. And then if we go to Milan, because Milan was not murdered by the plague, we can see that they are the largest city on the subcontinent, and that gives them even bigger bonuses, right? So if you have a city which is the largest in size on the subcontinent, then you get that bonus. Now, there's another bonus at this point in the game that goes to the biggest city in the continent. And the biggest city on the continent in Europe is Paris. Now, of course, this is not indefinite, this is not permanent. If there were a horrible plague, which often happens in Paris because it's big, if there is an army that comes and sacks it multiple times, if there's a famine, there's all kinds of things that can happen to kill off the population. If any of those bad things can happen, the urban population goes down for a time. And so if, for instance, we had a historical repeat of Paris's fate, and there were a plague that knocked it down to 12 or 13 urban population, then a city like Granada can take the title from them and become the largest city on the continent. And that's what happened for a very brief time historically. But because the plague that hit Paris around 1440 only really killed people and didn't really hurt the infrastructure or the reason that people lived there, Paris's population rebounded in real life, and the same exact thing would happen in game if a plague came through. It would kill off a bunch of people, there would be some distress and trauma for a few years, but because the fundamentals are still there, because it's still an important capital, because it still has infrastructure, all of those people would start to come back relatively quickly because all of the opportunity is still there. However, if Paris is continually the subject of invasion and plague and it's looted numerous times and the actual country itself begins to shrink, then all of those fundamentals that made Paris a big city will begin to disappear and the population will dry up as well. So Paris is not destined to be a big city. If it gets trashed enough or France takes a big enough beating, it can end up getting demoted quite a bit. And I have seen that happen in a few games. Doesn't happen often because, you know, France always does reasonably well, but it can happen. So, on the flip side, urban gravity is just one thing that spurs city growth. In addition, what also spurs city growth is available food in the region, right? And so people can't live in cities unless there's food to support them. And so we can see that there's actually quite a bit of farming efficiency in northern Italy. And all of that extra farming efficiency is capable of supporting either rural industries or cities. So the more free food you have, the more cities can grow. If you go someplace like, you know, out in Eastern Europe, you can see there is not a lot of extra food. So they don't support they're incapable basically of supporting very much urban population. So if they can up their farming efficiency, they're capable of supporting more population in cities. But even if you don't have a lot of food in a region, you can still tap into something known as the Continental Food Pool. And so when we click someplace like over in Austria, we can see they're producing wheat, right? Well, that wheat doesn't just disappear every year when it's produced. What actually happens is this represents the wheat that is exported abroad, right? Every rural population in the game is assumed to be doing some amount of farming, but when there's a trade good for wheat or cows or grapes, whatever, that actually means that that's food for export. And so in this case, in Austria, this wheat is being sent to the Continental Food Pool, and then it ends up going to the various big cities which are hungry for food, right? And so, for instance, if you decide you want to start a city, a nice big trade city on the southern tip of Sardinia, but there's not a lot of food available, you can always end up tapping into the Continental Food Pool in order to fuel growth, though that tends to be quite a bit slower. So that's Continental Food. Interestingly, if cities are doing really well and there's a lot of urbanization on the continent, it actually will spike the price of food, and that'll actually spur farm estates to upgrade and produce more food for export because it's more profitable for them, and they will then rise to attempt to meet the demands that the cities are putting on the Continental Food Pool. Okay, so that's food. Let's see. So there are a lot of mechanisms to control out of crazy ass city growth. Food is one of them, right? So even if you somehow manage to get the money to build tons and tons of buildings, and you get tons and tons of gravity, if you don't have the food, it's still city growth will end up being stifled, right? And farming efficiency can only really be improved relatively slowly. The Continental Food Pool as well can be exhausted, and so food tends to have a controlling effect on urbanization. You can't just urbanize through the sky. It has to be a progressive thing. In addition, basically a city has something known as an infrastructure level, urban infrastructure. The bigger the city gets, the bigger the infrastructure level becomes as well. And you can see here that there has been 5,500 ducats invested in Venice. Or another way of looking at it is that all of the buildings that are there are worth a total of 5,500 ducats. Every time you build a building, the money that you spent on that building goes into the ducat pool of urban infrastructure. And so the higher that pool gets, the bigger that local build cost down there gets as well, right? And so basically when you decide that you want to start building some urban buildings here or there, you do so based on what you have to gain versus the cost of building stuff there based on the urban infrastructure. So you could, for instance, build a new urban infrastructure building for 1,980 ducats in Venice, which would give you, a very concentrated amount of urban growth. Or you could go someplace like a smaller province, and build a town hall, which produces, I guess that localization isn't working, but it gives urban gravity as well, for only 217 ducats. Or you could build, a workshop which only costs 290 ducats in 6 or 7 provinces, right? Instead of just building one in Venice. Right? So you kind of have to weigh those costs and benefits. But what that means is that you can't just quickly and easily spam buildings in Venice. Even though something like a new corporation guild would really be beneficial and net you a lot of ducats, it's 1,320 ducats to build, right? Because Venice is already such a bustling commercial center. So that helps to control out of control buildings, right? And so far it seems to be working pretty well. Another little thing about urban infrastructure is that it can actually be damaged, of course. So if someone comes in and decides to burn the city to the grounds, that will end up, and of course looting the city as well, that'll end up subtracting some of the ducats from the urban infrastructure. And what will happen is some of the buildings will be demoted based on how much the damage was, right? So if you take 500 ducats out of the urban infrastructure, it'll end up scrapping a building. And in this case, it'll probably be like, for instance, a warehouse, which is kind of an auxiliary building, right? I believe the AI that Desumon wrote prioritizes the more important core buildings, or it might scrap the shipyard, right? And then the army that attacked you ends up carrying away all those ducats that they looted. They'll also loot the local wealth pool, which I'll get around to probably next video. I won't tell you right now what it's all about, but you can see here that every single province has its own local economy and it accumulates its own wealth and ducats. And so there are actually a lot of ducats wound up in the private economy that can be used by private individuals in the province to build new buildings or invest in different things. We'll get to that more later in another video. Okay, so that's just about everything. Before we go, let's do a quick walking tour of Europe. I promised Gigao we wouldn't get very far out of Europe because he has a few surprises for you, but let's go to our special map mode here that we made for seeing all the different types of pop data. So we're going to look at city data because we want to examine where all of the cities are in Europe. Okay, so if we look on the trade map, red, of course, means no city. And as you go through yellow, through green and toward blue, the cities are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, with blue and purple being the very biggest. You see Venice is a pretty big city, and of course northern Italy is just chock full of cities because it is the center of the Renaissance after all. There's a reason why it happened there and not in, for instance, Eastern Europe. You can see in Eastern Europe there are very few cities. Not very good farming techniques, so they can't really even support cities very much at this point if they tried. You can see even more in the east in Poland, Lithuania. Not very many cities at all. Right, there's a few cities of one population, maybe 2 or 3 if you're lucky. Of course, Scandinavia is pretty small as well. Even Copenhagen's just one urban population. Germany is a little bit better. And right, one of the big urban centers in this period was modern-day Belgium, right, Netherlands area. And you can see that we have quite a few large cities, and it's obvious why, because Flanders in this era was a major manufacturer of luxury cloth. They make tons and tons of luxury cloth, and so therefore tons and tons of people are in the city to make that cloth. You can see there's lots of important centers of production there. Flanders is like crazy rich because of it. I think they have like half the income of the entire Kingdom of France. You can see a few cities over in Britain. France is actually pretty decent, not horrible, but you can definitely see that Paris is sucking up most of the oxygen as far as cities are concerned, right? There's just about as much urban population in Paris as there is in all of the rest of urban France combined. You see southern France, and Languedoc has a few nice places. Provence is a nice, reasonably sized city. Spain is quite urban too. On average, not nearly as much as Netherlands or northern France. Aragon is pretty nice. I mean, it doesn't look like this is a lot of population, but when you consider their rural population, they're pretty urbanized by comparison. Portugal, not super urbanized. Andalusia is basically on par with northern Italy, as well as Flanders. Of course, Grenada's pretty populous. North Africa, we actually have some pretty good urbanization in Fez, in Tunis, and of course, once we get over to Cairo, right, this is basically the behemoth of the Western world at the moment. You can see their infrastructure level is huge, even dwarfs Venice. And Sicily is has a lot of really nice urban pop. Though a lot of these are in collections of smaller towns and things like that. Palermo is the biggest city. As we get to Greece, we have some decent urbanization, decent cities. Constantinople is okay. The Levant is actually pretty nice, and you can see they actually do a lot of manufacturing of urban goods. And Damascus and Aleppo are both pretty populous as far as cities are concerned. Damascus is minor center of trade, important center of production, produce a lot of steel, actually. Good wealth. I mean, obviously, Venice is about twice as built out as Damascus is. Right, and that should be about it. So, thanks for listening, guys, and like I said, I'll be hopefully releasing a new video every week to show you a new feature, and believe me, there are many features to show. I haven't decided which to show next. I may end up going with wealth, just because it kind of matches what we did here today, because wealth tends to concentrate where the cities are. So anyway, thanks for listening, and come join me on the forums if you haven't already, and help us discuss all of the up and coming features that we'll be seeing in M&T. So thanks.